Good afternoon. I'm Penny Bishop. I'm Dean of BU Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. And I'm happy to welcome you to this month's edition of Conversations with the Dean. In this webinar series, we focus on a range of important topics within education. Our discussions reflect our college's deep commitment to transforming systems, particularly those that are inequitable. Each of our webinars focuses on the complexity of the issue at hand and seeks to uncover the transformational opportunities to see students and communities thrive. We have grounded our series of webinars in our Guide Star commitment, and we elevate work that's aligned with our shared values and our systems orientation. And today, our topic is a very timely one about creating space for students to examine race in the classroom. We'll explore practical strategies for navigating the crucial work of anti-racist teaching. And we also want to acknowledge that these are not easy or comfortable topics for many teachers, and even more so in the current times. So we'll touch upon why it's important and honor teachers who are doing this work. And I'm really very pleased that we have two experts to talk with us today about how complex this is and how we can ensure that all students have an opportunity to grapple with complex ideas and improve our communities in general. So we're joined today by two faculty members in BU Wheelock's Education Department, both very highly qualified to speak on this topic. Dr. Christina Dobbs, welcome. Christina is an associate professor and director of the English Education for Equity and Justice program here at BU Wheelock. Her research interests include adolescent writing development in the disciplines, supporting culturally and linguistically diverse students in secondary classrooms, disciplinary literacy, and teacher beliefs and professional learning. Christina is a former high school teacher from Texas and also the editor of the recently published book, Preparing Anti-Racist Teachers, Fostering Anti-Bias and Equity in Teacher Preparation. So thank you so much for being with us today, Christina. Second, we have Dr. Tina Durand, a clinical associate professor of applied human development here at BU Wheelock. She is the program director of the PhD in counseling psychology and applied human development. Dr. Durand is a developmental psychologist with a background in community-based programming for families, and Tina is a former K-12 public school teacher. Her recent book is titled Making the Case for Race in Middle School, Supporting Adolescents and Teachers in Critical Racial Consciousness and Advocacy. Welcome both. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today, and I know our audience is as well. We have a great turnout for today's webinar. Welcome to our audience, those who have joined us before and newcomers. It's really great to have you here on today, the first day of spring. I want to encourage our audience to pose any questions that you have in the Q&A box, which you should see, and we will do our best to address them. I can guarantee we will not get to all of them because there are always so many good questions and comments from our audience, but we will do our best to integrate them to the extent possible. So without further ado, let's get started. So I'd love to have you, each of you, start us off by telling a little bit about what brings you to this work as teacher and counselor educators. I love that we have both teacher education and counselor education in one space, and I think that's going to be a really rich part of our conversation today. Would love to have you start off, Tina.
Great. So happy to be here. Thank you, Dean Bishop. Wonderful to be here with everyone. I'm Tina Duran. I'm a clinical associate professor in counseling psychology and applied human development. And as Dean Bishop said, I've been an educator for a long time. That's my heart. So every week, that's what lights me up, my students. I come to this work again as a white individual who has been working for many years now on anti-racist advocacy and what that means for me as a white person and as a white teacher. My journey started as an early childhood teacher. I've always been interested in creating and structuring affirming learning environments. That is continued to be the case here in higher education. I teach courses on development, on culture, and a course that I developed and have been teaching for about almost 15 years now is around the psychology of race. So really, the book that I wrote really brings together my teaching, both in K-12 and early childhood, in higher education, and also as a developmental scholar who really has studied and looked at the benefits of understanding diversity, diverse environments, dimensions of identity as affirming and developmentally salient for young people. I mean for the book to bridge theory and practice. And it also is meant to legitimize and celebrate the very hard work that teachers and counselors do. Like, you are centered in this. Like, it is hard work. So it really is, again, my commitment to the field, to commitment to practitioners, and commitment to young people in helping them to understand themselves and each other in really becoming productive, engaged citizens.
Thank you so much, Tina. Appreciate that perspective. Dr. Dobbs.
All right. Hi, y'all. Nice to see some names I know in the chat and nice to sort of meet those of you who I have not met before. I'm Christina, and if we haven't met before, I identify as Latina and multiracial. And maybe some of you don't know this, but I'm the only person of color in my family. And when I was a kid, nobody ever talked about it, and that was very hard. And I had a really hard time making sense of things. And I grew up sort of feeling like surely no one else in the world had my experience, because things that we keep silent, kids maybe like me might be interpreting that they don't exist, and that things did exist for me, and that was sort of complicated. And it's been a lifetime of sort of working my way through that. Then fast forward, I'm 20 years old. It's my first day of teaching. I walk into my high school classroom. I'm 20. I'm teaching seniors. The oldest one of them is 19. That was not, that was imperfect at best, but I was in an incredibly racially diverse classroom, and my kids had different cultures and different languages and different religions and all of those sorts of things. And they wanted to talk about it a lot of the time, what made them similar, what made them different. And I had not felt tremendously prepared in my own teacher preparation for how to do that work thoughtfully and successfully in a way that was developmentally appropriate. And so I have sort of been on a journey of learning how to do it myself ever since. And along that way, lots of other wonderful teachers have worked with me and helped me work through things and build better structures for teachers to learn the things I wish I had known much sooner, but I'm glad to know now.
Thank you very much. That's helpful. It's very helpful to ground our conversation in both of your experiences. So this idea of creating space to talk about race has really been characterized in lots of different ways. We see in the media, we see in the government, we see it in lots of areas where there are people are using terms a lot, often incorrectly, and often synonymously. We hear things like anti-racist teaching, critical race theory, critical race consciousness, culturally responsive teaching, wokeism. We hear a lot of different frames for the work that we are trying to talk about today. I would love to dig in a little bit about how each of you would describe the approach and experiences that you hope we use with students. I think that's really important for our audience to have an understanding of what it is we actually mean when we say create space for talking about race. And so maybe not so much the label, but the experience or outcomes that you envision for students. Help us know what that feels like or looks like. Christina, would you start us off?
Sure. I am not to play the English teacher card, but I am one of those. I'm not usually one to be pedantic, but in this particular case, I think it is important to note, like, those phrases, critical race theory, critical consciousness, they don't mean the same thing. And so it is sort of important when we're talking about them to do that with some thoughtfulness and precision around saying what we mean. I hear critical race theory all the time. I do some anti-censorship work and it comes up constantly, and people yell at me about teaching critical race theory, but I don't teach legal theories to young children. Actually, I think a lot about critical consciousness. And so I will say in my case, that is the part of this that I'm super interested in critical race consciousness. Critical consciousness is the ability to recognize, analyze, and then do something about oppression when you see it. I think primarily about teenagers. So when I'm talking, that's usually who I'm talking about. But that is important to me because I know, and we have lots of evidence to suggest that kids often blame themselves
Mm,
for their circumstances, for their outcomes, for their achievement. And that when we talk to them about things like, well, perhaps you go to a school that doesn't have as many resources as some other schools, and what is that about? That they show better outcomes in lots of ways. They have better achievement, they're more resilient, they're more likely to be civically engaged. They are happy to tell us they want to talk about those things. And so sort of, it's not just the sort of talking about that sometimes things are inequitable, but it's
mm,
also encouraging people that they could do something about that. And young people throughout the history of the United States and across the world have always led movements toward more equitable societies. And so I sort of come at it from that angle, and that is sort of the uh, outcome I am trying to envision in my own way of thinking about this work. I don't know, Tina, what about you?
I love that, Christina. I love the way it's so nuanced. When I think about, what is it that we're trying to accomplish here, um, in terms of critical racial consciousness, I do think of it as multifaceted, right? So, young people, and I think I agree at this point, Christina, I'm also thinking about young people and adolescents. They might have an understanding of race as a dimension of identity, but it's not always nuanced, particularly if you're a white person. And again, I'll speak from my own positionality, um, what that means, right? And they have not been socialized to have to think about that. So yes, it is a dimension, right, of who we are and a dimension of identity for sure. But we also, in our racial groups, have a social identity, i.e. the racial groups we're part of matter and they impact, right? They are impact, and our experiences in groups and how those are stratified mean that we have access and experiences that are different. And that leads us, again, the other dimension is what Christina talked about in terms of institutions, right? That a critical racial consciousness is an understanding of how race, right, is salient in institutions and how inequity is embedded in our institutions like schools. We can look at these with young people, look at the data, but they can feel and see them. They can see who's represented, right? In our presidential office, in our leadership positions. They can see and think about and need to understand that they are in segregated schools, perhaps, and in segregated communities, and that those things are not just chance, right? So having a deeper and a more richer understanding of the salience of race in society, in institutions, it helps them to understand themselves in the world better. And that's really about what we, as educators, like, isn't that what we are part of, is helping young people to have a richer understanding of themselves and others, right? In a democracy, in an engaged citizenry is the way I think about it.
It makes me think about folks who might put forth that teaching about race, is divisive, and that it creates more problems in the classroom and in community. That we shouldn't be pointing things like that out. It's not the role of school. Christina, you mentioned earlier, you started to mention some outcomes, I think, of that are quite research based about what happens in schools that do, in fact. Could you elaborate? Is it good for kids?
Um, sure. I think it can be good for kids. I think we have to do things well for them to be good for kids. But I think it can be, we did a study recently where we led teacher teams to do this work of talking about critical consciousness, which is, I should have said before, a fellow Freudian concept. Got to say his name. Don't want to get struck by lightning. Um, we did a study in 5 schools across the United States with lots of different compositions. One of the schools, primarily kids of color, almost all of them Black. Another school, almost all white kids and white teachers, and a range of sort of compositional diversity in between that. And they did this work during advisory. They had these conversations, they built communities, things like that. And I think even some of the teachers who participated would have said they had the fears that you named, Penny. I think if you feel those fears, I understand why, and I understand why in this moment. But we did that work together. We had a team of sort of working to learn how to do it. And I think the reason I know it's not divisive is because the kids told me that it wasn't.
Yes.
At the end of the study, we talked with kids who on both surveys and in interviews reported in huge numbers that it made them feel closer to their classmates and feel safer in their schools and more belonging in the sense of their community to have had these conversations, which were not, I don't think, always easy, but were sort of supported and intentional and developmentally appropriate. Even babies notice when their caregivers have different skin color than their caregivers, like babies. So to pretend that just because we don't say things out loud that people are not thinking about them or noticing them is just foundationally untrue. And so, if kids told me at the end of doing this work that they felt upset or that they did not feel those positive outcomes, I'm not sure I would be on this call saying that I think we should do it, but in all the experiences that I've had, and that one that I just gave is just one example, and I'm going to talk about it at the forum, come to the forum. I think they are saying unequivocally that it was important to them and that they think school is a right and appropriate place to do that work. We asked them that outright. And they all said yes. And we worry that kids won't have an opportunity to have these conversations if we don't do it in school. And their perspective, it really matters to me. And I think we should listen to them.
Mm.
You touched upon this idea of being developmentally appropriate or developmentally responsive. And that makes me think a bit about how this work does look different at different levels. And I think people might wonder about what it actually does look like for elementary or middle or high school. Tina, you've worked across a wide array of age groups, and I know your recent book focuses on middle school. I wonder if you could help us paint the picture of what it looks like for students at different levels of the academic journey.
Sure. Before we do that, Penny, can I go back to actually something that also Christina said?
Please.
I love about just young people, when you give them the opportunity, and it's supported in the developmental literature as well. I found that in my own data collection. If young people are willing to answer questions with a researcher and be frank about talking about their identity, the salience of race, what they're confused about, what they're excited about, what they want to learn more about, how much more powerful is it to do that with a trusted teacher? I've heard that from college students as well. How come we haven't talked about this? And the other piece that I wanted to touch on is that ickiness, right? That ickiness we feel and that tension around talking about race, that's part of our socialization and the silencing. And that's a cost for all of us. And that's part of what's dividing us. That's contributing to the division, right? So when I think about this question about divisiveness a lot and not understanding ourselves, others, and not understanding inequitable systems, that's what's dividing us and not bringing us closer together. So I just felt like I loved what Christina said and just kind of wanted to add to that as well. But so you asked about the developmental piece, for sure. So as I said, I was an early childhood teacher, and it is the case that we're going to talk about issues of race and what is embedded in it differently and in different ways. But when we think about fundamental concepts like fairness and kindness and differences and what's important, we can have those conversations with young people they have an understanding, right? And have an understanding and experiences with sharing and fairness and what hurts and what doesn't feel good. I was thinking the other day, as a former kindergarten teacher, I had this morning when I was thinking about our conversation today, a memory came to me, and I thought about literature and all of the wonderful books and literature that are there in early childhood, and that teachers are experts, right, at modifying and adapting and building on. And I remember reading a big book, and I still remember the picture of it. I should have looked it up today, but I didn't. It was called In 1492. So we know again what the topic of that was, around again Columbus's journey, right, into the New World, right, here in America. And it was a rather sanitized version, right, of that history. And I was reading it in gorgeous colors, and it had cadence and rhyme and all of that. And again, it was a sanitized version of the history, if you will, of our country. And I was reading it, and a young student, a kindergartner, said to me, didn't anticipate this, "Teacher, my mom told me that Columbus and the explorers weren't always nice to the Indians that were here." So there's a spontaneous comment, and then you have an opportunity as a teacher. What am I going to do about that? And I think I answered it fairly simply. Would I go into what genocide is? No, not with young children, right? But I did provide some acknowledgement. Yes, that's true. Actually, the Indians were here first. This was their land. They had things that they knew how to do. They had things that they shared, and actually explorers came in and changed that. Does it feel good when you've built something and you have ways of doing something and somebody comes in and changes it? Right. So those are the kinds of things I think in early childhood when we make it relevant, but in a developmentally appropriate way. It's funny. I thought of that this morning. I thought, wow, how would I come at that differently now? But that's the type of thing as teachers that we do. That's the creative spirit that we have. In middle and high school, of course, we can address these constructs perhaps more directly. One of the things as a developmentalist that I love about the adolescent period is it a wonderfully rich, pivotal period of perspective taking and identity development, and expanding critical thinking skills and cognitive capacities. We can start many times, and I talk about this in one of the chapters of my book. We can start with young people and something like the very broad construct of culture, unpack that with young people. Again, what's culture? What are all the dimensions of culture? Race is a component of that, but it's not the only thing. We can talk about, again, those kinds of issues around and dimensions of identity and traditions. What does it mean to be American? Things like stereotypes are another way in. Those are very salient to young people. They are highly sensitized to the social environment. Again, we can talk about history, again, thinking about curricular content. We don't want to relegate, something like history and race only to particular content. How do we infuse that right into our content and our curriculum? And what are the careful questions in middle school and high school that we can ask, right? Whatever we're doing, whose perspective is this from, right? Who's left out of this story, right? Who benefits, right, from when we're color? What does it mean to be colorblind, right? Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Who benefits, right? So all of those kinds of critical thinking questions are exactly, right, what young adolescents and adolescents are really cognitively poised to really be able to engage deeply in.
I would just add one quick thing to that too. And there's a question in the chat about race and ethnicity. I do think those are different things.
Yes,
And I had said a thing about you have to do it well for it to
yes,
work. I do think part of the doing it well is making it work in the particular place where you are. Who are these kids? What experiences have you had? So we did, not the study I talked about before, but a different study in the school at the Bronx. In the Bronx, well, almost all the kids at this school in the Bronx are Latinx, but some of them are Afro-Latinos and
yes.
some of them are not. And they have lots of thoughts and questions about, things like colorism and all sorts of those things. We have to do the work in a way that addresses the parts of the world and their own identities that those kids are trying to understand better.
Yes.
And so, and I think then we think, well, if you're in an all-white school, those kids have lots of questions too.
Mhm.
All
Absolutely.
kids do. They've never been in a space and wanted to have a conversation about this with kids, and they disappointed me by having nothing to say. They always do. But I think part of doing the work and doing it well is taking all those great tools we have and thinking about, in this place, what are the conversations that could be meaningful to us as a community?
Yeah, love that. Love that. And I
You know,
love thinking about it's so exciting. And again, my experience again is more in higher ed, and then I will acknowledge that um, hearing and having the space where young people hear each other's experiences and give testimony is really powerful. And that speaks to what Christina is saying, is how are you working with the localized population that you have and really addressing the issues and the needs and the young people that are part of your community, right? In relevant ways that are meaningful to them. But it's very powerful. And again, you talked about white students. Again, the burden of this is not on students of color to do all the talking. So that's an important thing to be thinking about as well.
I appreciate your both of you highlighting sort of the importance of the local context. And it strikes me that local context matters a lot right now politically,
Right.
and how and who does this work and how one does the work. And in both nationally and in states all over the country, teachers and school practitioners have come under increasing pressure to avoid lessons or dialogue with students that focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I know you've both been preparing and supporting educators of various kinds in this climate, and wondering if you could talk about how you've done that and how, if at all, it has shifted in the past few months. Christina, you want to start us off?
Sure. Our wonderful custodian is at this moment vacuuming right outside my door, so I'm really sorry if that's happening and it's causing feedback. Yeah, I've done a lot of work on this front and a lot of talking with teachers. I'm on the committee against censorship at the National Council of Teachers of English, and have been thinking about, this idea that anyone is hoping that kids will be hurt or harmed in any of sort of doing this work, instead of feeling more supported and more resilient and more successful as a result of it. I don't think teachers who feel nervous about doing this work in this moment, I don't think their worries are unfounded. I don't think they're unreasonable. But I often give teachers some advice that I maybe will be helpful, hopefully. One thing to think about is, what are your local school policies about how curriculum gets made? How could you talk with kids and their caregivers and people in the community about sort of coming together, having feedback loops, some of that before? The more people are involved in the work of thinking about what we do and talk about with students, the less likely they are to be afraid of that same curriculum. Thinking about what your school censorship policies are before you start. Like if someone challenges a book for whatever reason, it might be race, but in these days it could be any other number of identity factors that could be quite relevant. Do you have a policy in place for how we're going to talk about those things if they come up? Do you have, I mean, it is hard to make those kinds of decisions once the thing has started. Figuring out where you are, figuring out what the plan might be, talking with your leaders about their take on some of these things could help you figure out ways to do this that don't feel like they threaten your job or are going to be largely controversial. And the other thing I would say to teachers is to not work alone. There is a difference between a teacher, and I do think those teachers who are out there doing it alone, I admire you. I think that's an incredibly courageous thing. But if you do feel afraid, building coalitions of people who do this work together, that makes it much easier to sort of navigate, to have colleagues, to have a feedback loop, to have a sounding board, to have all of these things that you might need. And then to find spaces where you can learn about how to do this work. Like if you had an education where some of this was silent and you didn't learn about it, that is not uncommon. And it's not an accident that that might have happened to you. So if you have learning to do and you feel like you want to do that work, there are lots of tools and resources to do that, to try to do some of that learning on your own, to help you feel like it's not just my own perspective that I'm trying to bring to the classroom. I am relying on evidence-based practices and what we know really helps students and all of those things. If you want to do that learning, you should give yourself that time and space to learn and ask your school to support you to do it, in the hopes that sort of, I don't know what's happening totally with the political climate and some of those things, but I do know that taking some of those more proactive steps can help you to feel more supported in sort of doing this work and not doing it by yourself.
Sounds like very wise advice, Christina. Thank you. It's really helpful. Tina, how about you? How are you thinking about that?
I love what Christina said, particularly around not doing this alone and doing it in community. Thinking about community as well. And I'm going to bring up another stakeholder, which are parents. I do think, again, part of this also is educating parents, and I am not meaning to apply. Teachers and counselors already have a lot, but it may well be part of that work is finding there are parents out there that believe in this work, that want this work to be done and want to support us. Again, building and working with families as well is part of our work. And then those families that are resistant, again, it's hard, but engaging in those questions, like, tell me more. What is it that you're worried about, right? So you can start to, and have that process of education, which again, I acknowledge is hard. Teachers are already doing a lot, but I do think families and parents and as stakeholders also can be powerful resources as we seek to do this in community. I think it's a moment that, when I was starting to write the book, the resistance and the discourse that we're hearing around division and, that's been building for several years now. We know this, but I couldn't have anticipated exactly where we're in this current moment in time. But it is perhaps a moment for us to really clarify our values. I think as teachers, when we have clarified our values, we will move differently in the classroom. And as teachers, I love what Christina said earlier too. We need to do this well. Again, I think of myself as a white teacher and what the work that needs to be put in terms of my understanding, my humility, and what that means to do this work effectively. If you don't have an understanding of systemic racism, et cetera, historical racism, you're only going to go so far, right? So the work really begins with ourselves. I really believe that. And I think about some of Bettina Love's work. She's a Black scholar at Teachers College now, I think, and she's does amazing work with teachers. And I was at a conference and she was reminding all of us, like, folks, conflict is going to be part of this work, like it always has been. It's really us learning to navigate and stay in it. And as a white teacher, I need to build my stamina to do that. So it's complicated for sure, but I love holding on to the piece of doing that in community and finding out, again, in your school, who you can do this in community with. again, acknowledging that in higher ed, perhaps we have more academic freedom, if you will. So I want to be sensitive to the fact that teachers, K-12 teachers, may well feel more vulnerable, right? Maybe it sounds easy for Christina and I to say that, but that we can do this work with perhaps more freedom, but we all are feeling, right, that the tensions and the threat. Yeah, for sure.
I'm so, oh, please go ahead, Christina.
Oh, I was just going to add just really quickly that made me think, Tina, of a day of teaching that I remember because I felt like the biggest failure in the world. And that was, I was a teacher on September 11th, 2001.
Ah, yeah.
And I had, the world happens no matter what I talk about in my classroom, and kids are aware of it. I was in a class that my first period that day had 4 young women in it who wore hijabs. We didn't have assigned seats because I'm just not that kind of teacher. And um, after that happened, the next day, no one was sitting near them.
Hmm.
And I felt like I didn't know what to do. And if I knew then what I know now, I would have done things very differently. But teaching English is about how stories help us understand the world better. And on that day, I needed to help my kids understand the world better. And this set of tools that I have been working on for learning for a long, long time, I think would have gone a long way toward that end. And I think we muddled our way through and we were a pretty good community by the time it ended. But I wish I had had some of this language, some of these tools, some of these teaching ideas to do everything differently that day. I mean, I can still see it just like it was yesterday. And those moments are going to happen.
Yep.
Kids are going to be aware of them. And if we pretend they're not happening, I think that sends them a message about whether and how we think their lives outside of school are relevant to us.
Absolutely.
Um,
It's so hard to think about you not having see, but again, it's a testament to we're all learning and growing. Like to hear you say, Christina, and I've been there too, like goodness, I'm thinking through that. I was stymied. We're all in that space. Like I hear you, like you are so amazing. I'm like, Christina was in that place, right? But it's just, I think it's very, it's humbling for all of us.
Well, thank you for that. But I do want to normalize, like, it's okay to say,
Yeah.
I didn't learn about this. I
Yeah.
didn't know
Right.
about it. I would like to start today. One of
Right.
my favorite sayings in the whole world is that the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, but the second
Yeah.
best time is now.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
like now is fine. Let's do
Yeah,
now.
absolutely. And your story does also remind me of a book that I should have put in the resources. It's a lovely book. It's by Alyssa Hadley Dunn, and it's called Teaching on Days After. And she has actual data from
Yeah.
teachers and young people. It's a wonderful book. Yeah.
It's easy to feel disheartened in this time. There's a lot of stress and uncertainty in the world, and one of our audience members, Nancy, just reached out to say that she's finding the talk disheartening, and I would agree that that is not an uncommon way to feel right now. Um, and at the same time, I know that there's really great work happening in this area. And I think we have tended to emphasize how hard it is right now because we want educators to know and counselors to know that we see you and understand that it is a really hard time. And yet, when I read both of your work, I am inspired by it, and I recognize that good things are really happening, and there are great examples. And I wonder, we're about to run out of time, but we have a couple of minutes left. If you might both speak to Nancy's comment a bit in terms of, leaving us on a more hopeful and optimistic note than, because you both see really good examples happening in the world and in your own classrooms and beyond. Is there, can you leave us with an example or words that might inspire?
I don't know if this is inspiring, but I can try. Um, Yeah, I think I too, Nancy, have felt disheartened, and I would be lying to say otherwise. And I do sometimes worry that progress is receding. And what does that mean? But then yesterday, I went to a high school to work with teachers. about the task of what it means to teach American literature in this moment. What does it mean to say something is even American today? And I don't think they're doing great, all of them. I think they're experiencing some stress. But if you want to have hope, go to schools and find it. It's pretty straightforward that always happens for me. My brilliant friend Sherry Deckman, there was a quote from her dissertation that she didn't say, so she doesn't like it when I attribute it to her, but I don't know who said it. That we can be unified without being uniform. And I think we confuse those two words a lot. That we fear that naming that we're not uniform means we can't be unified. But I find again and again that not to be the truth. And that the more we talk about what it would mean to be unified, the easier it is to feel hopeful about that.
Mm, mm,
Thank you.
mm.
Tina, how about you?
You know, it's funny. I also go to students, but right now I'm having less opportunities to be in school. I'm anticipating another project with my colleague, Dr. Michael Medina. So again, plug for the forum next week. We'll both be speaking at the forum together. But um, just thinking about our students here at BU Wheelock, I have two amazing groups of students. I am teaching one of the capstone courses for the first time this semester that has all BU Wheelock education and human development majors. And I think to myself, they are coming. They are so committed. And yes, I also have days where I feel like I'm cycling always. Like I just want to stay in bed. Like I don't have the energy for this, but I don't stay in that place. I think we have to be okay being in that place, but just trusting that there is good work going on and there is such commitment. And I get that energy from my students. I think of myself at their age and think of them as just so much more committed. I don't know, again, we didn't talk about the role of social media. My students say, I learn a lot from social media. My consciousness was raised. There's also a lot of not so good in social media, which is another, argument for us having these conversations in a school, right? Because again, social media has its limitations, right? But I again draw on students and I think a lot, they are coming world. BU students are coming and they are amazing and they are passionate and they are tenacious. So again, they're coming. So they give me a spirit and hope.
What a
One
great
of my favorite 10th graders said to me that recently, well, when I run things, it's going to be much better. And I was like, you know what? You're right. And all I can do is do my very best to get us to that day.
Yeah.
Very inspiring. And I'm so glad you brought students into this. I am just completely blown away by our students, their optimism, their leadership, their amazing capacity for change. And yeah, they are indeed the future. So thank you for that. I want to thank you both so much. You've provided so many insights and some tactics, and I know that many audience members will be taking things back and thinking about things anew. And I also want to thank the audience for joining us today. Really appreciate that. You've heard both Christina and Tina mention the forum, and we're really excited. For those of you who aren't familiar with what that is, we invite you, especially if you are intrigued by today's conversation, we invite you to join us in person for our annual BU Wheelock Forum on March 27th and 28th. We are focusing on thriving in the middle school years, and we will be exploring this challenging and rich and exciting period in human development known as early adolescence. Middle grades education is a real passion for me, and it's the focus of my research. And I'm really thrilled that we will be having some thoughtful conversations and explorations about what it means to thrive in middle school. Tina will be presenting a keynote on Friday and participating in a fireside chat with author Jason Reynolds. Christina's presenting her research at our poster session. In fact, I think she's having dueling posters. We haven't quite figured out It's not surprising to me that she's doing that because she's amazing. We haven't quite figured out the logistics of how to clone her. So we're really excited about the lineup and all that we have planned, and we'd love to see you there. Feel free to scan the QR code in the corner of the slide for the forum. We also look forward to seeing you for April and May for Conversations with the Dean, where we'll be exploring the impact of funding cuts on education research, and also how to make the study of science more meaningful to students. So thank you all for joining us today. Again, big thanks to our speakers today, and enjoy the first day of spring.